Hi everyone. Now that we've learned how to factor, the next step is to learn how to solve equations by factoring. And we're going to start with equations that are already factored. That's the first step. And what I want to learn today is something called the zero product property. Now, the zero product property says if A times B equals 0. Now imagine A and B can be anything. We're saying we have two numbers or two things. We are multiplying them together and the answer is 0. That's why we call this the zero product property. Product means multiply and the answer is 0. Now the second half of the zero product property says if that's true, if you have A times B equals 0, then either A is 0 or B is 0. So 0 is a special number. It's the only number this works for. What we're saying in words is if you have two numbers multiplied together and the answer is 0, the only way that can happen is if at least one of those numbers was 0. And if one of those numbers is 0, it doesn't even matter what the other one is. It can be 0 times 1 or 0 times a million. The answer is still 0. So basically, if you have two things multiplied together and the answer is 0, then you know automatically that at least one of those things is 0. So let's go ahead and try to use this property to solve this equation for x. So our equation is factored. We have x plus 5 times x minus 3 equals 0. Now, even though they're factors, we have x's in there. I want you to realize that even though we don't know what x is, each of those factors represents a number. So for example, let's say x was 10. I'm just going to make up a number. If x is 10, then this is 10 plus 5. It would be 15. And this would be 10 minus 3. It would be 7. So those are numbers. One of them's a 15, one of them's a 7. Or maybe x is 3. Then the first one is 8, and the second one is 0. Or I mean, whatever. We don't know what x is, but if we did, those are numbers. So really what you're seeing here is the zero product property. This x plus 5 is our a. This x minus 3 is b. And what we have is a times b equals 0. So because of the zero product property, we know that either one or both of those things has to equal 0. So what we're going to do is we're going to separate it into two equations. I'm going to say either the first one, a, which is x plus 5, equals 0, or the second one, b, which is x minus 3, equals 0. Now see, both of those equations are very easy to solve. We can solve those in one step. If I want to solve the first one, I would subtract 5 from each side of the equation, and x would equal negative 5. And for the second one, I would subtract by adding 3 to each side of the equation, and x would equal positive 3. So those are both the answer to the question. We get two answers because if x is negative 5, the first factor is negative 5 plus 5. That's 0. And then we don't even care what the second one is because 0 times anything is 0. Same with the second answer. If x equals 3, the second factor is 3 minus 3, which is 0. Then we don't care what the first factor is because any number times 0 still equals 0. So as long as one of the two factors ends up equaling 0, then the whole equation equals 0. That's how you use the zero product property to solve equations for x. Now here's a discussion question. I'm going to work out a question and we're going to talk together in the video about whether I did it right or not. So let's say the equation we're trying to solve is x plus 1 times x minus 3 equals 6. So I say, well, let's do what we did in the last one. It's factored. I have an x plus 1 and an x minus 3. It's equal to 6. That's the number this time. So let's just separate it. The same thing as we did last time. Let's take this one and say this one might equal 6, or this one, and this one might equal 6. So I would say either x plus 1 equals 6, or x minus 3 equals 6. And then we'll solve each one. The first one I would solve by subtracting 1 from each side. And I kind of did the work side by side. I'll jump straight to the answer. The first one, I subtract 1 from each side. cancel out the 1, we're doing this basically, and I get 6 minus 1 is 5. The second one, I add 3 to both sides to cancel here. 6 plus 3 is 9. So I get x equals 5 and x equals 9. So the question becomes, are those the right answer? Now, let's check. If we want to see if they're the right answer, let's try plugging one of those numbers in. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take the 5, x equals 5. I'm going to substitute 5 for each x, and we're going to see if it ends up equaling 6. So if I do that, the first one, if I put in a 5 for that x, I get 5 plus 1, which would be 6. And for the second one, I get 5 minus 3, that would be 2. So what we're really saying is 6 times 2, and 6 times 2 doesn't equal 6, it equals 12. So that answer is wrong. Let's try it with the 9. If I put a 9 in for x, my first factor is 9 plus 1, that would be 10. My second factor is 9 minus 3, that would be 6. 10 times 6 equals 60, it doesn't equal 6. So that one's wrong. So those are definitely the wrong answers. What we want to do is figure out why. And to figure out why, to understand why, remember the name of the property we learned. It's called the zero product property. That only works, this process only works if it's equal to a 0. Because remember, the zero product property says if I'm multiplying two numbers and the answer is 0, one of those numbers has to be 0. It doesn't work for any other number. If I say I'm multiplying two numbers and it's equal to 6, we don't know what those two numbers are. It might be 1 times 6, or it might be 2 times 3, or it might be 12 times 1/2. You know, there's an infinite number of possibilities if you start including fractions. So we have no idea what those numbers are. So all of this work was wrong. You definitely don't want to do this work, the big X through it. It needs to be a 0. So let's put that into the video, into the notes. So a very, very important concept for this type of question, you can only solve by factoring when the equation equals 0. If it's not equal to 0, then you can't use the zero product property. So remember the title of the section. It was actually called Solving Equations in Factored Form. This is what factored form is going to look like. Factored form is going to have two factors. It's going to be x plus or minus something times x or plus or minus something. It doesn't have to be x, it can be any letter. And it has to be a 0. So factored form, I'm going to use a common notation that a lot of books use. I'm going to call it x minus p times x minus q. And don't worry about the p and the q. It seems kind of confusing to put those letters in, but we'll explain that when we get to graphing. But basically, x minus p times x minus q, and it has to be a 0. That's what we call factored form. If you get to that exact form where it's two factors multiplied and it's equal to 0, then you can just separate those two factors, set each one equal to 0 separately, and solve. All right, one last thing before we finish up today. There's going to be some vocab words you see kind of spaced out throughout the rest of the year. There's a lot of different ways for me to talk about answers to this question. So the answer to this type of question, it can be called a solution. That's an easy one. A solution is an answer. It can also be called a 0. And that actually comes from the zero product property. It comes from setting it equal to 0 and solving. It has to be equal to 0. So if you see a question, and like if I give you a worksheet and it says, find the zeros of this function, it's asking you to set it equal to 0 and solve. Another one is the roots. If I give you an equation and say, find the roots of this equation, that's another one. Now for me, I usually try to keep it simple. Like on our quizzes and tests, I usually just say solve for x, period. Make it nice and simple. But just so you know, if you see those other words, those also mean solve.